A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Luke. Jesus addressed this parable to those who were convinced of their own righteousness and despised everyone else. Two people went up to the temple area to pray. One was a Pharisee, and the other was a tax collector. The Pharisee took up his position and spoke this prayer to himself. O God, I thank you that I'm not like the rest of humanity, greedy, dishonest, adulterous, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week, and I pay tithes on my whole income. But the tax collector stood off at a distance and would not even raise his eyes to heaven, but beat his breast and prayed, O God, be merciful to me, a sinner. I tell you, the latter went home justified, not the former. For whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and the one who humbles himself will be exalted. The Gospel of the Lord. Well, I was told to speak a little bit in my homily about vocational discernment this weekend, and in particular, perhaps what path I took to my vocation. I think I'd say I have lived a pretty normal life. My vocation story is not like Father Erickson's, where he's perhaps drumming in a rock band one day and gets a call to be a priest and drops his sticks. I imagine him dropping his sticks and going to the seminary. I'm sure it didn't turn out like that, but I'm a pretty normal guy. I'm a Catholic. I am one of 10 kids, so must be a Catholic family, right? 10 kids. I'm second of 10. And I have this memory of of being a little embarrassed at my high school graduation because my mom showed up pregnant. And I, being a high school kid, was a little bit embarrassed about that. But I never went to jail. And I think perhaps the closest I got to jail was one time I was following my brother Joe and his friend Steve near our home, and we came up alongside the freeway in the ditch, and we thought it'd be a good idea to, it had freshly snowed, and we thought it'd be a great idea to lob snowballs up into the oncoming traffic. And we were doing this, we were having a good old time, we were, listening for vehicles coming, and we were throwing, I was quite young, by the way. And we decided we had enough, and we walked home. And halfway home, with our tracks in the snow, a cop car comes up behind us and pulls us over and says, "What are you doing? Were you guys throwing snowballs over at the freeway there?" And of course, we were completely busted. Our tracks were there for everyone to see. And what happened is, apparently a woman truck driver had her windshield cracked because of us. So we got a free ride home the rest of the way to Mom and Dad's house, and we got a talking to. We were threatened that we'd have to pay for the windshield, the broken windshield. But he didn't send us to jail. I was so happy that he didn't. So I've never actually been to jail or made it to jail. So I think I've led a pretty mellow life. But in high school, I had a powerful conversion. I went on something called Teens Encounter Christ, a tech, and I experienced people who were on fire with their faith. And then my parents ended up getting involved with the charismatic renewal, and I followed them along a bit into a group called the Community of Christ the Redeemer. And then through that, I got exposed to something called Net Ministries, where you could serve for a year conducting high school retreats. So I did that for a year. And you would think I would have been a good candidate for a priest, right? Never been to jail, serving the Lord, going from town to town. People would find out that I had never gone to jail and that I was still interested in religious stuff, and the old ladies would sometimes pull me aside and say, "Have you ever thought about becoming a priest?" And at the time, I was really not at all interested, and so I would shrug it off. But in my 20s, I discerned, or I wanted to take some time of discernment to see whether God was calling me to the priesthood or singleness for him. And it turns out that a friend of mine, Kevin Finnegan, and I went out to Michigan to a brotherhood out there to discern this. And it was the same brotherhood, in fact, that Father Bill Baer, our former pastor, was a member of, and then he left and decided to join or to become a priest. So I went out there, and it was pretty clear after a while that God was not calling me to that sort of life. God was not calling me to priesthood nor single life. So I come back to Minnesota, and a little while later I met my wife Rachel, and she swooped me off my feet, and the rest is history. And I figure, now I know my vocation, right? My vocational discernment is over. And my life proceeds on. I'm happy. Kids start coming. Pretty soon we have 6 kids. I have a nice house. I have a dog named Grizzly. I play hockey on Saturday mornings. I have friends. I'm still praying. I'm still following my faith. But inside I was sensing a little discontent, or I was feeling like perhaps there was something additional that God wanted me to do. And it was at this point in my life that the word deacon started popping up. And in the circles that I ran, that was not something that I was familiar with. So I really didn't know what a deacon did much and what that life was all about. And many people that I talk to who have gone on to become a deacon have experienced people telling them, "Oh, you'd make a great deacon. Why don't you think about that?" But that wasn't my experience. That was off my radar. And so when the Lord started bringing up this word deacon to me, it was a real curveball in my life. And if you would have asked me, as a matter of fact, 10 years ago, what a deacon was, I probably would have said something like, well, they're kind of like priest wannabes, right? They kind of want to wear the nice clothes, and they want to be married, but kind of do religious stuff. Or deacons are for those people who have time on their hands. Perhaps they're retired and they want to serve the church that way. I really didn't know much about the vocation. But as I started to pursue it, take a couple steps towards it, and they started showing me what the vocation was all about, I felt as if I was on the ground. My feet were firmly on the ground, and a little rumble happened, and an incline started to lift me up and to kind of gently move me in a certain direction. And I felt like a magnet almost being pulled to something. And yes, I had fears and insecurities and all sorts of questions popping up. But what I also felt was an enchanted sort of pull towards something, a pull to perhaps a gift that God wanted to give me. So the first thing I experienced about this particular vocational discernment was that magnetic force called God. God was that magnet calling me, but respecting my free will. And it probably was something similar to Jesus when he appealed to Peter. And Peter, he was fishing, he had a life, but he felt this irresistible pull, drawing to follow Jesus. And he left his nets voluntarily, not out of duty. So God inclines our hearts to do his will. And he allows us to feel the magnet. And he works with our desires. So a man discerning priesthood, for example, may have an attraction to find a lady and to get married, to have a wonderful life with children. But if God is calling him to the celibate priesthood, he will feel an even greater desire towards that. And a man doesn't choose to give up wife and children and simply out of cold duty. He does it out of love. And love always involves desire. It always involves attraction. And it is attraction that made Peter drop his nets and to follow Jesus. So the first principle of vocational discernment is that God inclines our heart, our desires, according to his will. And our job then is to get into a place where we hear, where we can feel the magnet, we can feel the incline moving us gently in a certain direction. A second principle, I'd say, of vocational discernment is the recognition that God wants, that God is a giver, and he wants to give gifts. And we all know that gifts are things that are supposed to make us happy, not sad, right? And it reminds me of the doghouse video. I don't know if anyone's seen the doghouse video. A husband and wife are in their living room. It's their anniversary. The husband has a present for the wife. It's wrapped up, and she starts to unwrap it, and she's all excited. And she unwraps the present, and it's a dual bag vacuum cleaner. And she's not happy at all with that present. She's livid, in fact. And so she grabs him by the ear and she leads him to the doghouse outside. And he goes in the doghouse and he goes down the chute into this purgatory type area where men are folding laundry and learning how to give correctly, how to give gifts that please another. So, if celibacy and priesthood is God's gift or his call, his vocational gift, it really is a gift, and people can be happy. If marriage is a gift that God, a vocational call for you, then your spouse is a gift, a unique gift to you. And if additionally you're called to be a married deacon, then you have the potential to be even happier if you receive that gift. God doesn't give vacuum cleaners to us unless we really, really, really like to vacuum. So vocational gifts fit. And like that video, in the case of a diaconal call, the wife has a major part in discerning that. The wife and the husband together always are looking, is it right for our marriage? Does it fit? So the church pays a lot of attention to the wife. In fact, the church pays a lot of attention to the wife's thumb. And if the wife is thumbs up, then everything is A-okay. If she goes, I don't think this is the right fit for our marriage, then they'll send the guy packing. Even if the Pope wants you to become a deacon, even if the bishop wants you to become a deacon. It respects the existing marital union. So this means that vocational gifts fit in with gifts that have already been given us. They fit with marriages. They fit with life circumstances. They fit with skill sets. They fit with temperaments. But it doesn't mean, though, that they fit perfectly or that they fit without any difficulty whatsoever. And one of the things I realized as I was being drawn to this particular vocation is I realized, deacons end up standing in front of people. And, they aren't solely behind the scenes. And I'm a kind of behind the scenes sort of guy. And I'm very uncomfortable standing. I've told you before, I'm very uncomfortable standing in front of others and speaking and that sort of thing. I remember being an altar boy, almost dying up here sometimes, just aware that everyone was looking at me. I get all nervous. So there may be difficulties, there might be obstacles in following a vocational call. And vocational discernment then also involves growing in trust for the one who is calling. realizing that God knows us better than we know ourselves, trusting that He will give us what we need to do what He is calling us to do. And you've heard the saying that when we consider the nuts and bolts of living our vocations, God doesn't always call the equipped, but He equips the called. God doesn't always call the equipped, but He always equips the called. And a young man may think that he would never be able to be celibate for Christ. But God says, trust me, I love you. You may think you can't do this, but trust me, we can. You will be very happy. And in my case, it was, I know that you get nervous in front of others, Dan, but I'm calling you. And my power can even turn weaknesses into strengths. Another thing I'd like to say about vocational calls is that they are not discerned alone. God He always uses other people to help us figure it out. Now, we may think we have the gifts. We may think we are hearing the voice of God. We may think we know the will of God. We may think we are even God's gift to the priesthood or to the diaconate or to this particular spouse, this woman or this man. But God uses other people to help us figure out our vocations. And in the case of a religious vocation, above all, God uses the church to confirm whether we have a true vocation. And sometimes us fiercely independent Americans especially like to think that we know what is right for us. But when it comes to vocational calls, the church has the last word. And finally, I'd say a true vocational call will bring peace. And peace is a difficult, well, it's an easy word to say, but it's a difficult word to describe because it's an interior feeling. But you and I know when we have peace. We know it when we feel it. It is the peace that passes understanding. It is the peace of the child safe and content on his mother's lap. And I remember for my 2 vocations at the cathedral where I got married there, and I was in front of all these folks, I felt a great peace. And later when I became a deacon there and was ordained, I felt a great peace. It was a great gift to have. So to conclude, I'd say a few things. Vocational discernment involves paying attention to God who is inclining our heart one way or the other. It involves paying attention to desires. Vocational discernment involves recognizing that there is a good giver who wants to give gifts. And the gifts that are being offered are good for the person that they're being offered to. And it can make them happy and it can make them fulfilled. Vocational discernment involves ourselves and other people determining whether the gifts fit, whether they synchronize with the other gifts we have received, whether it fits at this particular moment in your life. Vocational discernment involves getting to a place of trust where we trust that the gift will be good for us and it will make us happy. And finally, vocational discernment looks for the presence of peace throughout the process. Peace despite obstacles that appear to be in the way. Peace despite fears. Peace despite unknowns and question marks. And I think I'd finally say about vocational discernment, it was alluded to in the second reading, where Paul was called to be an apostle for Christ, and then he feels himself being poured out like a libation. It says, poured out like a libation in the service of others. And I think that's really what vocation is all about. It's not as much about the gifts that I have and the gifts that God wants to give me and that sort of thing. It's more of God wants to use me to bless others. God wants to give us vocations in order to pour out ourselves in love for another. So if you have a vocation to marriage, God wants to pour you out as a gift for your spouse. And the same thing applies regarding vocational gifts and religious vocations. So God is constantly calling. May we listen to his voice.